Well, hello there. Just thought I would get on here quick, hopefully quick. I tend to talk too long about topics, but I wanted to address the idea that self-defense is finite. Um, to me, the real elephant in the room is that you may have taken a self-defense course at one point. You may have decided that you no longer need a self-defense course, and the elephant in the room is that you may not. You may never need to use any kind of self-defense training. You always, of course, when interacting with other people, you run the risk. You never know, and ultimately we think we know, which is why we don't often follow through on training. We let life dictate to us what we think is our expectations, I guess, for lack of a better way. And so self-defense is one of those things. Hey, how you doing? Self-defense is one of those things that you can fool yourself into not needing, and or the catch-22 is that you can train in it and never use it. So what I would say for people who are not training in self-defense is that the day comes when you need a skill that you don't have. Obviously, that's a dilemma. Likewise, by training in self-protection, self-defense, you have the option then of passing those skills and that knowledge on to others. And they may need it even if you never do. So to me, the real issue is whether or not you're willing to take control of that facet of your life and get good training. How you doing? Thanks for joining. If you don't take the time and make the effort to pursue any kind of self-protection knowledge or training, and it doesn't always have to be physical. Self-protection is not strictly physical. The whole purpose of self-protection is really to teach you how to be aware of your environment, how to be aware of the situations you find yourself in, how to recognize threats, which I call threat awareness, and then how to mitigate the need for any kind of physical interaction. That being said, if you're in a predatory situation, most always your situational awareness and things like that have failed, and you really have no recourse but to engage in some physical capacity to resist. So, again, the question is will you ever need it? Will you ever need to be trained in the physical skills, or even what we would call soft skills, situational awareness, threat awareness, environmental awareness, boundary setting, all of those things? And to me, I guess what it comes down to is that those are skills that you can contextualize over and over for other areas of your life. You don't strictly have boundaries that relate to inappropriate touch. It's really more the concept of boundary setting. Learning how to do it then frees you up to be able to do it in other ways. So, boundary setting as a facet, even situational awareness, environmental awareness, all those things can also relate to your jobs, your everyday life. Here's a boundary for you that a lot of people don't realize. I didn't for a long time. It took a friend of mine bringing it up to me to say, this is a boundary I'm not willing to move, before I understood. And his thing was, well, if I work overtime every day and I am willing to sell myself on a salary for no additional payment, basically, then that just becomes the standard. So the next time when I'm expected to do more over and above, I will have to stretch even further. And that made sense to me. The expectation will be what you normally do, not what the expectations of any boundary are what you allow to happen. So when you learn to set boundaries, for example, particularly in self-protection situations, defining space, defining touch, defining how people speak to you, what you're willing to accept, what you're unwilling to accept, what you're willing to do about it, what you're unwilling to do about it, then you can apply those things to other facets of your life. And your life becomes a lot more free. And the thing about boundary setting in general is you don't owe anybody an explanation for that. You don't have to say, well, I'm sorry, I need this space, blah, blah, blah. You just need space. And it doesn't matter worth shit whether anybody agrees with it or not. It's really up to you. It is your boundary. And it's pretty indisputable. So thanks for joining. Yes, so I think, the notion of boundary setting is like, it's one of those facets of self-protection, self-defense, that once you understand it, you can apply all over your life. And once you can frame it in a way that is about what you're willing to accept, what you're unwilling to accept, what you're willing to do about what you're unwilling to accept, and what you're unwilling to do about what you're unwilling to accept, then you can start to apply that in other areas. But even situational awareness applies in our jobs. Environmental awareness, it depends, right? It can apply from a safety standpoint and things like that. But these are all skills that you can learn about through self-protection, self-defense, and you may never ever have to protect yourself. And the beauty of learning them is that once you learn them and you learn to employ them regularly, these are skills you can pass on to anybody. So even if you never ever have to use self-protection, self-defense physical skills, you can still be teaching and passing on all of the what I would call emotional, psychological skills to others. And those are the things that nobody talks about, And here's another facet to learning self-protection that I think is often overlooked. People will take, let's say, a women's self-protection course, and they do it once. It's a 4-hour weekend thing, and now they feel good. And shame on that instructor, first off, because it isn't their role to make you feel invincible. It is their role to be honest with you. 4 hours of any kind of training in anything is only 4 hours of training. You cannot expect to have all the answers even after decades of training. And the reason is because it's contextual. Everything that happens, every situation, every individual involved, all has a unique context. And so this notion of arming yourself after a weekend course is silly. It's really about this process of learning. And again, like I said, the catch-22 is a lot of people go through their whole life and never need it. Statistically, you are probably safe in saying you will never need self-protection. Unless you're a woman or a girl growing up, your risk of actual assault and things like that is pretty low, except as a woman. So 1 in 3 is the standard for women and girls. So what does it look like? Well, again, the thing is, it's almost always going to be somebody you know. More than 3/4 of the time, it's going to be an acquaintance, it's going to be a family member, it's going to be a service tech, it's going to be your doctor, it's going to be your priest, it's going to be your pastor, it's going to be your nurse, whatever. Your eye doctor, your dentist, your neighbor, your cousin, your uncle. That is the facts. The facts are I think it's 79% of the time it's a family member or acquaintance that will assault you as a female. And so once again, the whole notion of stranger danger, it's like, yeah, you may or may not ever be assaulted by a stranger. It's a pretty slim chance. But knowing how to set boundaries, knowing how to identify risks and risky behavior, that should all be part of self-protection training. And so risky behavior is not a finger-pointing thing, but for example, a risky behavior is getting onto an elevator with somebody when you have that weird feeling that you shouldn't, and you do it anyway. That's a risky behavior. And it doesn't matter if anything happens that time or not. It doesn't change the fact that it's a risky behavior. So this is not a finger-pointing thing. It's really more about just, being able to put words to self-protection, self-defense stuff. And so knowing like what is healthy and what is unhealthy. So those things are all accomplished through that kind of training. You're not going to get that outside of that training usually. And so you may go through your whole life and never ever need anything related even remotely looking like self-protection, self-defense. But you might. If I knew tomorrow that my risk of going outside and being assaulted or attacked was 100%, be damn sure I would be doing something to try to prepare the day before. If I knew next week it was going to happen, then I would damn sure be being prepared. If I knew there was no way to avoid it, I would do what I could to be prepared. So let me flip that around. If I was going to live in a world where that's a possibility and have no idea when it's going to happen, then common sense would tell me that I need to at least do some things to mitigate that. That does not mean I have to take a physical course. It does mean I need to find my voice under stress, because absolutely everybody who is attacked will have a 1 to 2 second delay while their brain gets flooded with chemicals, and that will pause you no matter what and who you are. And the only difference, the only reason that doesn't happen is if you have enough time for that all to occur in a way where you still have awareness. So what that means is incorporating situational awareness, environmental awareness, threat awareness, and all of those things step you through that process so that you have more time for that chemical change to occur and it doesn't reset your brain. And then some people never get beyond that, and they will go into freeze mode, and freeze mode is usually broken up into some ideas like, I have no idea what to do at all. This is so confusing to me that I'm frozen. Some people do it as a method of yielding because they think if they fight back that less will happen to them. Statistically, that's not true at all. Statistically, people who fight back suffer no more or less injuries than anybody else. And in fact, 96% of the time, people who fight back against sexual assault, it is stopped before anything occurs of consequence. So, there are ways to look at this, and then there's understanding of the entire context. And you go through your whole life, nothing happens, that's cool. Another issue is you have now skills and information and wisdom that you can pass on to others. And to me, that is really the core idea of guerrilla self-protection. My goal is to educate others so they can educate others. It's not a pyramid scheme. You can do your own thing. It's up to you how to progress. I will support you any way you want to be supported, but the goal here is to get you guys interacting with your own communities and with your own friends, with your own neighbors, with your own family members, and starting to mitigate risk in those close circles, in those tight circles, and then teaching boundary setting, for example, to not only girls but boys. When you teach boys and girls alongside of each other that there are things like boundaries and that they are okay to enforce, then you start to educate boys on how to interact with girls and vice versa. So to me, all of these things are connected together, and you can tell me, when I took self-defense class once, it was great, I feel strong now, whatever. Okay, that's good. That confidence is a portion of it. But actually having skills that you can bring into play on an everyday basis, that you can raise families with, that you can help other people who have families with, are critical pieces to kind of stopping this whole abusive rape culture, really, for lack of a better way to say it. When we stop neglecting the reality that this is happening, when we stop focusing on the opposite sex as being basically a sexual focus, then we can start changing this. And when we can use this as a stepping stone for developing the skills of boundary setting and the enforcement of boundary setting, this is where self-defense should go, right? When you set a boundary, you know what that boundary is. Now here's the thing, every time it's contextual. You have different boundaries at work than you do at play at your house. You have different boundaries there than you do at the club. You have different boundaries in there than you do in a taxi cab, right? Now there's some overlap, but just understanding that, I think, changes kind of the scenario on and value of boundaries. And then it's like, well, what are you willing to do about it? There comes a point at which you have to be able to physically respond. That doesn't mean that you have to have kung fu ninja skills, really. Most of the time, you need to just be ferocious as hell if it gets to a place where it's violent. When you have these boundaries and you have these things understood, it's way easier to identify a predator. And again, context could be your work, it could be your job. There are people who are preying on you at your workplace for the things you do at your workplace. I don't mean sexual assault. None of that, right? Your coworker could be taking advantage of you because you're just nice, right? You don't tell him to pick up his shit and take care of his stuff and do his work, and so you just keep doing a little bit extra and a little bit extra and a little extra until you resent that person. But if you had healthy boundaries to begin with, you could recognize that's bullshit. You need to set that boundary in the beginning and say, this is not what we're going to do. You need to pick up after yourself. You need to take care of your shit. You need to do your work, etc. Those are all aspects of boundary setting. And then, what are the steps that you're willing to take when somebody is unwilling to change? Well, obviously confrontation is good, and then mitigation with a manager would be good, and then going to a boss, and so on and so on. And ultimately you got to decide, is this worth leaving a job for? Do I like this job? Do I transfer out of this position? So these are ways to use boundary setting in your workplace even. So these are skills you can use everywhere. You just have to know what they are and how to do that. So so again, that's just my take on it. The notion that self-defense, self-protection is finite, like you take a class once and you've got it figured out. Well, let me just say that any skill that you've put 4 hours of work into, and usually in a self-defense class, you're going to put less than a half hour work on any skill, so you maybe cover 8 skills, a half hour's worth of value. It makes you feel good because you've learned some stuff, but if you don't implement it, I don't care, it will go away. It's just like anything else. So if you're not willing to do the physical stuff because it freaks you out or makes you uncomfortable or whatever, I can appreciate that, but there's a point at which then you need to really focus on the other stuff, which doesn't have anything to do with being physical. It has to do with avoiding the physical by having healthy boundaries and setting up your situations for yourself. So, and then context is king. Okay, that's my final point. I won't go on. I've already prattled enough. Context is king. What you do for self-protection will be different from man to woman, and will be different based on the situation. A abusive, violent husband who drinks and batters you is a different type of situation than sexual assault by a stranger. And one self-protection course will never address all of those variations, and that's why it's important to understand that it's a process. Self-protection, self-defense is a process. And likewise, if you're a realtor, this is a whole other area of vulnerability. From a professional standpoint, you have vulnerabilities, and you might work late hours at night. In the case of a realtor, you might travel to isolated locations on the regular with strangers, or basically strangers. So just because you can identify somebody's name does not make them not just an acquaintance. And just because they tell you a name doesn't mean it's their name. So, unless you have full background information and stuff like that, you can't trust that they're telling you the truth. So there are a lot of ways to mitigate that. I think realtors underestimate the danger they put themselves into. I think that bartenders and waitresses underestimate the danger they put themselves into. I think some of these fitness people on Instagram who are flaunting themselves, physically and putting down their locations and stuff, you are putting yourself at risk. And it may not happen, it may not ever happen, as I mentioned earlier, but there is a possibility that just because something hasn't happened ever doesn't mean it will never happen. So paying attention to how you set up your life, how you interact on social media, those are all things that matter. And context, again, is king. You cannot prepare for one thing by preparing for another. So if you're worried about sexual assault, perhaps you've been a victim before, then the way to prepare for that is to take a self-protection course, which again should include all of those nonverbal things and boundary setting and all that stuff that we've already talked about. But it should also directly address things related to sexual assault. If it's not doing that, it might have use, but it won't have as much use as it could. And given the fact that most people don't take things much further than they actually need to feel good, the more focused and intent and the more intention it has to address your actual needs, the better it's going to be of value. So I don't buy white paint thinking it's going to be gray paint. It's just not what you do. So this is kind of the process for self-protection, self-defense. So it's real long. I appreciate you all joining. What's up, Randy? Woo! Thanks for everybody who popped in, and I will save this thing and run it up on my YouTube as well. I'll post a link at some point. All right, talk to you later.